The cold Chicago wind whipped around the corner of LaSalle Street, but I barely felt it. My hands were shoved deep into my pockets, clutching a single piece of paper, my own death certificate. Dated 3 days ago. Cause of death, massive coronary event. I stared up at the marble columns of Sterling National Bank, the institution that held my life's work. Inside, my partners, Richard and Marcus, were probably toasting their good fortune over the liquidation of my assets. They thought I was ashes in an urn. They thought 54 years of my life, my company, Summit Ridge Investments, was now theirs for the taking. They were about to learn just how alive a dead man could be. Richard Sterling. The name was a cruel joke. His family hadn't founded the bank, but he acted like he owned the city. He was the face of Summit Ridge, all charm, expensive suits, and a handshake that felt like a contract. Marcus Thorne was the numbers man, a quiet, owlish figure I trusted implicitly with our finances. He was my son's godfather, for God's sake. For 30 years, we were a trinity. Richard brought the clients, Marcus managed the wealth, and I was the foundation, the one who found the deals, who saw potential in forgotten lots and derelict buildings. I built the damn thing from the ground up. They were my brothers, closer than blood, and that's what made the betrayal so perfect. They knew every account, every password, every weakness. They didn't just want my money, they wanted to erase me completely. A fake heart attack on a solo fishing trip I never took. It was clean, efficient, and utterly devastating. They'd used my own trust as their primary weapon. And now, they were sitting in my bank, spending my life. I adjusted the collar on my coat. Showtime. It all began in a cramped office above a Polish deli, the air thick with the smell of fried onions and ambition. 30 years ago. We were just 3 hungry guys sharing lukewarm coffee and one big dream. I was the architect, the one who saw a skyscraper in a condemned warehouse. Richard, with his $1 million smile, could sell that vision to anyone. And Marcus, my son's godfather, he was the magician who could make the numbers work. We called ourselves Summit Ridge because we were a single climbing party, roped together, aiming for the top. For 2 decades, it was perfect. We built half of the new Chicago skyline, and the trust between us was the steel frame holding it all up. I would have taken a bullet for them. I just never thought they'd be the ones to pull the trigger. The rot started with the Apex Tower, our masterpiece, a legacy project that would scrape the clouds and cement our names in history. But it was a beast, bleeding money faster than we could pour it in. That's when the late-night meetings started, the ones I wasn't invited to. Whispered calls that abruptly ended when I entered the room. I'd find Shell Corporation documents on the printer, funneling money to offshore accounts. When I asked Marcus, he'd just shuffle papers and mutter about tax efficiencies. I finally cornered them in the half-finished penthouse of the Apex. The city lights a galaxy of jewels at our feet. The numbers for the steel supplier are inflated by 20%, Marcus, I said, my voice flat. And Richard, these investor reports are pure fiction. This is fraud. Richard didn't even flinch. He just draped an arm over my shoulder, his cashmere coat feeling like a shroud. Arthur, my friend, you're a builder, not a banker. The stress is getting to you. You see ghosts in the spreadsheets. He smiled, that disarming smile. You know that solo fishing trip you keep putting off? You should go. Take a week. Disconnect. We'll handle everything here. Marcus just stood by the window, his back to me, looking down at the city I'd helped build. He simply nodded. He's right, Art. We've got this. They weren't suggesting a vacation. They were building my alibi, planting the lie that would become my death. My 40% controlling interest wasn't just a number to them anymore. It was the last wall they needed to knock down. They weren't just stealing my fortune. They were hijacking my legacy, and they needed me gone to do it. The memory burned away the Chicago cold, leaving behind a core of pure, unadulterated ice. They had built my coffin. Now, I was going to make them lie in it. That fishing trip. I never even packed a bag. The look in Marcus's eyes as he stared out over the city, it wasn't pride. It was appraisal, like a man measuring a property for demolition. My gut screamed at me, a primal alarm that had saved my skin on more than one bad deal. So instead of driving north to a quiet lake, I drove south to a dusty, one-room office I kept under a false name in Pilsen. My bolt hole. My insurance policy. The next morning, my access to Summit Ridge's servers was denied. User account disabled pending extended leave, the error message read. Extended leave, a euphemism for death. My hands were shaking, not with fear but with a cold, clarifying rage. I started making calls. My first was to Elena, a junior analyst at the firm, a sharp kid I'd personally mentored. She was loyal to me, not the letterhead. "Elena," I said, my voice low, "I need you to check the executive transfer logs for the last 48 hours. Use the emergency admin credentials I gave you last year." There was a pause, then the frantic clicking of a keyboard. Her voice came back a whisper, tight with panic. "Arthur, they're liquidating everything. Your personal holding accounts, your stock portfolio, everything. There's a power of attorney authorization signed by, it's signed by Richard, citing an incapacitation clause." Incapacitation, a neat clinical word for murder. But it was the next call that shattered my world. I called a contact at the county clerk's office, a man whose brother's company I'd saved from bankruptcy a decade ago. I asked him to run my name through the vital records database. He laughed at first, then he went silent. "Art, this has to be a mistake," he stammered, his voice thin. "There's a filing, a death certificate, issued 3 days ago." He emailed me the file. My own name stared back at me in stark, black font. Cause of death, massive coronary event. The attending physician was a Dr. Alistair Finch, a name I'd never heard. The witness address was a P.O. box in the Caymans, one I recognized from the fraudulent Apex Tower invoices. It was a closed loop of deceit, meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed. They had bought a doctor, forged a document, and with a few keystrokes, they had made me a ghost. This wasn't just about the money. This was about erasure. They were wiping away my 30 years of work, my name, my very existence, so they could claim my legacy as their own. My son, Leo, studying abroad, they would have sent him a check and a sympathy card, signed with their condolences. The thought made my blood run to ice. I spent the next 2 days in that dusty office, living on black coffee and fury. I listened. Months ago, when my suspicions first started, I'd planted a microtransmitter in a pen I'd given Richard as a gift, a cheap spy shop gadget I never thought I'd actually use. Now it was my lifeline. I heard them celebrate. I heard them mock my memory, calling me a sentimental old fool who couldn't adapt. And then I heard the detail I was waiting for. "The final transfer from Arthur's estate account is scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m., Marcus said, his voice clipped and businesslike. "Sterling National. I'll meet you in the private wealth management office. Once that wire clears, it's done. We're free." Free. I gripped the edge of the desk, the cheap wood groaning under the pressure. Oh, they were going to be free, all right. Free to face the consequences. I folded the printout of my death certificate and slipped it into my coat pocket. It was time for Arthur Vance to make a withdrawal. The lobby of Sterling National was a cathedral of commerce, all polished brass and hushed reverence. I walked past the security guard, a man who'd greeted me by name for 20 years. He just nodded, then did a slow, confused double-take, his brain struggling to reconcile the man he saw with the man he'd probably heard was dead. I didn't give him time to solve the puzzle. I took the private elevator to the 3rd floor, the domain of private wealth management. The air up here was different, thinner, smelling of old money and fresh coffee. I could hear them through the frosted glass of the main conference room. Richard's booming laugh, a sound I once associated with closing a big deal, now sounded like a hyena feasting on a carcass. I didn't knock. I simply pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. The laughter died in Richard's throat, choked off as if by a physical blow. He was mid-story, a crystal glass of whiskey in his hand. The glass slipped, shattering on the marble floor, the amber liquid spreading like blood. Marcus was staring at a tablet, a thin smile on his lips. His face went slack, the color draining from it until he was the color of old parchment. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, which I suppose he had. Seated with them was David Henderson, the bank manager, a portly man whose face was a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, counting down the last moments of their stolen empire. I let the silence stretch, letting it suffocate them. I watched the gears turning in their heads. Denial, then fear, then the dawning, horrific realization. Richard was the first to find his voice, a strangled rasp. "Arthur, it can't be." I gave a small, cold smile. I walked calmly to the head of the polished mahogany table, my seat, and placed the folded piece of paper from my pocket onto its gleaming surface. I flattened it with my palm. My death certificate. "There seems to be a clerical error," I said, my voice perfectly level, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "I came to clear it up and to make a withdrawal." David Henderson, the bank manager, picked up the death certificate as if it were a venomous snake. His pudgy fingers trembled, tracing my name. "Mr. Vance, this is impossible." He looked from the paper to my face, his eyes wide with a banker's terror, the kind reserved for catastrophic market crashes and federal audits. "Impossible is a strong word, David," I said, my gaze locked on my partner's. "I find fraudulent to be more accurate." Richard, ever the performer, recovered first. He shoved himself to his feet, his face a mask of practiced grief and shock. "Arthur, my God, it is you! We thought you were gone. There's been a terrible, terrible mistake. We were devastated." He even managed to make his voice crack. It was a masterful performance, one that had probably closed 100 deals. I didn't buy it. "You look devastated, Richard," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "Is that why you were liquidating my entire personal portfolio into a single holding account? Was that part of the grieving process?" Henderson's head snapped towards Richard, his confusion hardening into suspicion. "That was for your estate, Arthur," Richard blustered, gesturing wildly. "To consolidate things for your son, we were protecting your legacy." "My legacy?" I took a step closer to the table. "My legacy is not a shell corporation in Panama, Richard, and my son's inheritance is not destined for account number 74B-9 in the Cayman Islands. Does that number sound familiar, Marcus?" I turned to Marcus. He hadn't moved, he hadn't said a word. He just sat there, shrinking into his expensive suit, the tablet on the table before him displaying a wire transfer confirmation page. Ready to be executed. My entire life one click from oblivion. He flinched as if I'd struck him. "Marcus," I said, and the sound of his name in my mouth made him physically recoil. "Leo called me this morning. He wanted to know if his uncle Marcus would be at his graduation next month. I didn't know what to tell him. What do you think, Marcus? Should I tell him you were too busy signing off on my death to come?" A small, choked sound escaped his lips. The dam of his composure finally broke. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw not a thief, but a terrified, weak man who had followed a stronger predator into the dark. "Arthur, we." "Save it," I cut him off. I turned my attention back to the bank manager who now held the death certificate like a piece of evidence, which it was. "David," I said, my tone shifting to pure, cold business. "This document was signed by a Dr. Alistair Finch. There is no Dr. Finch licensed to practice in the state of Illinois. The address for the witness is a P.O. box in Grand Cayman. The same P.O. box, I might add, that receives quarterly payments from a Summit Ridge subsidiary that you, Marcus, created 2 years ago for off-book acquisitions." I let that hang in the air. The trap was laid. Now it was time to spring it. I wasn't just a ghost come back to haunt them. I was an auditor, and I had brought the receipts. Richard's face had gone from feigned relief to a waxy, sweaty panic. "This is absurd. Arthur, you've clearly had some kind of breakdown. David, this man is unwell." "Am I?" I reached into my inside coat pocket and pulled out a small, sleek audio recorder. I placed it on the table next to the death certificate. "Then maybe you can explain this to David." I pressed play. Richard's voice filled the silent room, tinny and clear. "Asterisk. The final transfer from Arthur's estate account is scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. Sterling National. I'll meet you in the private wealth management office. Once that wire clears, it's done. We're free. Marcus's voice followed, clipped and precise. Asterisk. The offshore accounts are ready to receive the funds. It's clean. No one will ever connect it back to us. I clicked the stop button. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any sound. Richard looked at the recorder as if I'd just placed a live grenade on the table. Marcus finally dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking. The performance was over. I looked at Henderson. His face was pale, his lips a thin white line. He understood. He wasn't just witnessing a dispute, he was an accessory, moments away from facilitating a multi-million-dollar theft based on a fraudulent death certificate. His career was flashing before his eyes. "David," I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. "I am Arthur Vance. Here is my driver's license." I slid it across the table. "I am the majority shareholder and founding partner of Summit Ridge Investments, and I am here to report a crime. As of this moment, I am instructing you to place an immediate and indefinite freeze on all Summit Ridge corporate accounts. Furthermore, you are to freeze all personal assets of Richard Sterling and Marcus Thorne held at this institution. Every checking account, every stock, every line of credit. Lock it all down." Richard lunged forward. "You can't do that, Henderson. Don't you listen to him." "I believe I can," I said calmly. "It's in the corporate bylaws. The same ones you use to cite an incapacitation clause to get your hands on my shares." I gave a thin, merciless smile. "Well, I'm not incapacitated, I'm right here. And I'm revoking your signatory authority. Effective immediately." Henderson stared at me, then at the two men whose lives were imploding in his office. He saw the truth. He saw the crime. But most of all, he saw the liability to his bank. He slowly, deliberately picked up the phone on his desk. His hand was perfectly steady now. He wasn't a confused manager anymore. He was an officer of the court. He didn't call security. He pressed a single button for his direct line. "Get me Sarah Jennings in the Legal and Compliance Department," he said, his voice a flat, hard stone. "Tell her it's a code black. And get 2 security guards to the 3rd floor conference room, now." Henderson placed the receiver back in its cradle with a definitive click. The sound echoed in the tomb-like silence. A code, black. The bank's internal equivalent of a nuclear alarm. Richard's face, already a mess of sweat and panic, contorted into a mask of pure rage. He finally broke, lunging not at me, but at the bank manager. "You pompous little clerk," he roared, his voice cracking. "You're finished. I'll have you managing a branch in a cornfield. Summit Ridge will pull every last dime from this bank." He never reached Henderson. The oak door swung open with a quiet, authoritative swoosh, revealing 2 security guards. They were large men, built like the foundations of one of my buildings, their faces impassive and their dark suits barely containing their bulk. They didn't enter. They simply filled the doorway, an immovable wall of institutional power. Behind them stood a woman in a severe gray suit, her expression sharp and analytical. This had to be Sarah Jennings from Legal. Richard froze, his outstretched hand trembling. His threats evaporated in the sterile, professional atmosphere. He was no longer a powerful client. He was a liability contained in a conference room. Jennings stepped past the guards, her eyes sweeping the scene, the shattered glass, Marcus's broken form, Richard's apoplectic rage, the death certificate and recorder on the table, and finally, me. Her gaze was like a laser, assessing and cataloging. "David?" she asked, her voice calm and clipped. "Sarah," Henderson replied, his composure fully restored. "This is Mr. Arthur Vance. We had been led to believe he was deceased. It appears we were misinformed." He gestured towards my former partners. Mr. Sterling and Mr. Thorne were in the process of transferring Mr. Vance's entire estate to an offshore account based on this fraudulent death certificate. Jennings's eyes narrowed on Richard. I see. Richard made one last, desperate play. This is a misunderstanding. Arthur is unwell. He's confused. We were just protecting his assets. I let out a short, sharp laugh devoid of any humor. Is that what you call it, Richard? Protection? You weren't protecting my assets. You were burying the evidence of your own theft. The Apex Tower fraud, the shell companies. It was never enough, was it? You had to have it all. You had to erase me. I turned my back on him, dismissing him completely, and faced Marcus. He finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and pleading. He looked like a man begging for a pardon on the gallows. 30 years, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to a low, conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than Richard's shouting. I trusted you with everything. My company. My family. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table. Leo asked about you. Asked if his uncle Marcus was still going to teach him how to read a balance sheet this summer. A sob tore from Marcus's throat. It was a raw, ugly sound. That was the blow that finally severed the last thread of our shared history. Not the millions of dollars, not the corporate theft, but the betrayal of a boy who loved him. All right, that's enough, Jennings said, her tone final. She nodded to the guards. Gentlemen, please escort Mr. Sterling and Mr. Thorne to the security office on the main floor. Do not let them speak to anyone. Confiscate their phones. The police are on their way. One guard moved toward Richard, who sputtered, You can't do this. I am Richard Sterling. You were, I said, not even turning to look at him as the guard took his arm in an unbreakable grip. The other guard gently touched Marcus's shoulder. He didn't resist. He shuffled to his feet like an old man, utterly defeated, his gaze fixed on the floor as they led him out. I watched them go, the two men who were my brothers, now just suspects being led away. There was no triumph in it. Only a vast, cold emptiness where a 30-year partnership used to be. It was justice, but it felt like an amputation. The door clicked shut, and the room was quiet again. It was just me, Henderson, and the lawyer. The war in this room was over. The war for my company was just beginning. I straightened my coat and turned to face them. I was no longer a ghost. I was the owner. Ms. Jennings, Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice hard as steel. I want a complete forensic audit of every Summit Ridge account going back 5 years. I want an injunction filed against every known personal and corporate asset belonging to Sterling and Thorne. And I want access to my terminal, now. We have a company to save. Sarah Jennings didn't waste a second. She picked up the audio recorder and the death certificate, handling them with the care a biologist gives a new species of viper. Mr. Vance, the bank will offer its full cooperation. Our internal fraud division will work with your legal team and the authorities. What you requested, the asset freeze, the audit, it's already in motion. Henderson, looking profoundly relieved to be on the winning side, chimed in. Your office terminal is active. We've restored your credentials. Anything you need, sir. Anything at all. I just nodded, my mind already churning through a dozen different scenarios, triaging the corporate wounds I couldn't yet see. The elation I expected to feel was absent, replaced by the cold, heavy weight of the task ahead. They had poisoned the company from the inside out. This wasn't a victory lap. It was the start of a long, brutal chemotherapy. I walked to the window, the same one Marcus had stared out of while he plotted my demise. The city sprawled below, my life's work etched in steel and glass against the gray sky. For 30 years I'd looked at that skyline with pride. Today, all I saw was a crime scene. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over the first name on my contact list. Leo. He answered on the second ring, his voice bright and distant from his semester abroad. Dad. Everything okay? It's late here. My own voice was rougher than I intended. Everything's fine, son. Just wanted to hear your voice. I paused, the words catching in my throat. About your graduation, I'll be there, I promise. Of course you will, he said, a note of confusion in his voice. Why wouldn't you be? No reason, I said, forcing a steadiness I didn't feel. Just wanted you to know. I love you, son. Love you too, Dad. I hung up and stared at my reflection in the dark glass. A ghost in a suit. Richard and Marcus were gone, but their damage remained. They had tried to turn my legacy into their payday, my son into an orphan with a trust fund. They failed. The bank was just the first battle. Now I had to go back to Summit Ridge and excise every trace of their cancer, piece by painful piece. The moral victory was won. The real war had just begun. Let's be real, if you walked in on your family trying to cash in on your fake death certificate, what is the very first thing you would do?